To be honest, I never thought I'd be in this situation. I'd always assumed everything was fine. After 5 years of marriage, my husband Thomas and I had been together for 7 years. Our world revolved around our 5-year-old. Ethan, our eldest son, has always been a very stable and predictable presence in our family. I work in marketing for a tech company, while Thomas has a very stable career as an architect. We both put in a lot of effort and our routine was just that, a routine. However, Thomas received a significant promotion approximately 5 months ago, which he had been. I was really happy for him. He'd worked hard for this promotion and it was a huge achievement. I was pleased for him, but then I realized what it meant. He was working long hours and sometimes not home until the early hours. I tried to be supportive, but it was tough. I tried to understand, but when he did have a moment, he was so tired that he could hardly say hi before he collapsed on the couch and frequently didn't even make it to bed. I convinced myself that he simply needed time to get used to his new role and that soon the workload would decrease. However, things only became worse as the days stretched into weeks and then months. I would wait up for you in the hope of spending a few minutes together and re-establishing our connection. However, he would be so exhausted that my attempts to communicate were dismissed or disregarded. There was also a lack of closeness. I would attempt to start a conversation in the hope that we could reconnect and rekindle that aspect of ourselves that seemed to have waned. But each time he would murmur, "I'm too tired, maybe tomorrow," while staring at me with half-closed eyes. That maybe tomorrow never materialized, and eventually I began to feel invisible. I missed the intimacy and the attentiveness. I had become a bit of an afterthought in Simon's life. Around the same time my work also became very demanding. Simon had a tiny but successful financial consulting business, and we were trying to get him as a new client to gain his trust. My manager kept encouraging me to go the extra mile and she gave me tips on how to be more personable. She said that she only wanted me to do everything I could to make him feel important, without going beyond any boundaries. I had to translate this to mean that I should keep him interested in happiness without breaking any laws. Simon wasn't at all what I had expected. He was older and divorced. Simon was childless at 48, which wasn't my type, but he had a laid-back, amiable air about him. He seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say, listened, and joked. It was a welcome change from the quiet I was experiencing at home. I vividly recall our lunch together. Ethan had been bouncing off the walls at work. I stopped and spilled water on my shirt at the restaurant, so it was a hectic morning at home. I brushed it off with a joke, but when I looked up, Simon was observing me with a calm, kind gaze. I pushed it off at first, telling myself I was overreacting and that it was simply friendly attention, but there was something in that stare that I hadn't felt in a long time. It was like someone was actually seeing me. There was something in his gaze that I hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if someone was actually seeing me, but he seemed to be able to read my thoughts. He would genuinely ask me about my day, laugh at my jokes and listen to me rant about work things that were lacking at home. I was acknowledged, and we started talking more personally. After months of feeling isolated, I was surprised to find myself feeling a renewed sense of connection. I began sharing glimpses of my personal life with Simon, offering him hints about the challenges I was facing with Thomas. I felt a shift in my isolation when he nodded and gave me that empathetic glance. I tried to convince myself that this was just a pleasant, platonic interaction, but I couldn't deny the growing feelings of intimacy. I told myself it was nothing serious and that it was just nice to speak with someone who was interested, but deep down I knew I was going too far. I started looking forward to our meetings with Simon. I'd think, I get to see him today, as I left the office, and it made me feel good. It was great to have someone look at me that way and make me feel important. It was almost addictive. I told myself it was just business, so I carried on, even though I knew I was going too far. But that line kept changing. I wish I could say I saw it coming and stopped it before it got out of hand. To be honest, I didn't, or perhaps I simply didn't want to. Every encounter with Simon was fine at first. We'd meet for coffee or lunch to talk about work, but over time, the focus shifted from the project to the need to escape. One lunch in particular stands out. Thomas was still in the thick of his promotion grind, so any attempts I made to engage with him were met with drained half smiles and hasty farewells. I'd had another difficult morning at home. I tried to express I was feeling lonely, but it felt like I was speaking to a wall. I was exhausted and eager for even a small dose of kindness when I finally saw Simon that day. I sat across from him and talked a little about my job and perhaps more than I should have about the difficulties at home. Simon listened intently, nodding and never once interjecting. It was satisfying to have someone listen to me and to be heard. I believe he sensed the loneliness and I was feeling pretty frustrated, but I kept it to myself. I didn't look away when he touched my hand across the table. I couldn't help it. My cheeks started to flush, my pulse raced, and everything around us seemed to blur as his hand on mine felt like something I'd been missing for a while. A connection. Someone who truly saw me. "You deserve someone who listens," he murmured. His voice grew softer. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he stared at me as if I were the only person in the room. I agreed to return to his apartment for coffee without thinking it through. We both knew it was a ruse, but the trip there was a blur and I had 1,000 reasons to turn around. However, the excitement and adrenaline rush were so strong that they overpowered all rational thought. I remember feeling as though I was. When we arrived, I looked around and noticed the unusual decorations. As we sat on his couch after he poured us coffee, I felt his arm against mine. We were both trying to ignore the tension in the conversation, which was quieter than usual. Then he leaned in and kissed me. I didn't stop him, I had no intention of stopping him. All the loneliness, rejection and months of feeling visible just vanished. It was as though I had been dragged back to reality at last after we arrived at his bedroom. Reality hit me hard and quickly as I lay there. The guilt was unbearable and I had passed a boundary that I couldn't get back. However, I couldn't deny the relief either. I felt important for once. So I hurriedly got dressed so as not to disturb. Simon and I left as quietly as possible. My mind was racing, trying to think of a reason why I hadn't picked up the phone. Seeing Thomas's name on the screen made my stomach turn with guilt because I had missed 2 of his calls. I practiced my response to his question about my whereabouts as I drove home. He was unaware and dozing off on the couch when I returned. I convinced myself it was a one-off. That night, he didn't ask a single question. He just continued with his routine, totally oblivious to the storm inside me. I felt like a careless, impudent error. However, the sensation that I had tapped into something I couldn't let go of persisted. Indeed, a few days later, I was looking at my phone, half expecting and half terrified that I would see a message from Simon. My heart was pounding when his name appeared on my screen and he recommended another cup of coffee. I said without hesitation, sure this time we could meet in a place where no one would know us on the other side of town. I tried to act calm as I sat across from him once more, but I could still feel the tension humming beneath the surface. Finally, with inquisitive eyes, he turned to face me and said, "Do you regret it?" I hesitated, but what was the reality? I didn't regret it. I was extremely guilty and felt terrible about it, but I didn't regret it. I didn't want to lose that sense of aliveness I'd had for the first time in years. I whispered, "I don't know." As I stirred my coffee, I avoided his gaze. His hand grabbed mine again in the coffee shop, and we held onto each other despite knowing it was dangerous. I couldn't stop, even though it seemed like I should. I felt like I was playing with fire once more. I couldn't bring myself to refuse his suggestion that we go somewhere more private, as the days stretched into weeks. I realized that I was leading 2 lives. I would try to keep things normal when I got home to Thomas, but I couldn't get rid of the rush I had from being with Simon. I knew I could stop at any moment, but I kept going. The wall started closing in, and although Thomas wasn't a fool, he was starting to get jealous. He noticed the excuses, the late hours, and the sidetracked chats. He'd make little remarks like he was I would put 2 and 2 together, but I would do it in a subtle way, rather than directly accusing him. I always brushed off his remarks and made fun of them, but I knew it was only a matter of time. One day, after another long lunch with Simon, I came back home to find Thomas sitting on the couch and looking off into space. I tried to be informal when I said hello, but he didn't answer. Instead, he looked up with a look on his face that showed a mixture of anger and pain. He muttered, "We need to talk," in a low voice, and my stomach dropped. I sat down with my pulse pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I knew he knew, and there was no going back now. It was even more difficult to look Thomas in the eyes since his face was inscrutable, a mix of uncertainty, anger, and something deeper. At last, he spoke in a calm but low voice. "Where were you today?" All of my prepared lines and excuses disappeared in that instant. All I could do was try to maintain a steady tone of voice and act as though perhaps just possibly this wasn't the moment when everything fell apart. I was at work, so I managed to say, keeping my eyes on the floor and avoiding eye contact with him. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and kept his gaze on me. He really inquired, his tone of incredulity piercing the last bits of denial were fading. "I'd planned to surprise you with lunch, so I dropped by your office. They said you'd already left." My face flushed, and my stomach fell. I knew that once he'd got me, there'd be no more hiding or acting. I started to say something, but nothing came out. He just waited, letting the silence linger until it seemed like everything was weighing heavily on me. "Thomas," I began, but my voice was barely a whisper. I was admitting it to him made me feel both free and guilty at the same time. He nodded slowly, as if he'd known all along, but hearing it from me made it real. "I spent a couple of months thinking about it," I confessed, but I didn't look at him. He asked a question in a tight voice, and he caught his breath just once before he spoke again. The room fell into silence, and it was more terrifying than any outburst could ever be. Why was his voice so quiet? I heard that one word, and it was filled with all the hurt and uncertainty I had created. I didn't know how to respond without coming across as an excuse. I couldn't describe the loneliness, frustration, and craving for attention that had brought me here. I said, "I don't know," trying to think of something that wouldn't come across as a cop-out. "I just had a feeling, an unseen one, as if you had lost sight of me." "Thomas," I could see the anger flashing in his eyes, but I didn't raise my voice. "I felt very alone, so you threw everything away because you felt lonely and betrayed me, lied to me and turned against our family." I felt ashamed. I knew he was right. I had allowed myself to become enmeshed in an error that had destroyed my life. I muttered an apology, but I knew it was insufficient. He turned away and I could see him squeezing his hands together as he swallowed his feelings. It seemed like forever. Before he spoke again, he wanted to make things right. I wasn't expecting that question. I realized how much I'd taken for granted. "I did make a mistake, but I don't want to lose you." He sounded tired as he continued, "I don't know if it's that simple, Sarah. I thought we were a team. I assumed we'd get through everything together. But then you just betrayed that confidence." The silence that followed was worse than anything he could have said to me. At last, he shook his head and left the room, leaving me by myself to deal with the mess I had made. He didn't go back to bed that night, as the truth of what I had done hit him like a ton of bricks. I lay awake and stared at the ceiling, feeling awful about what I had done. The one person who had supported me through everything had been hurt by me. The following morning the silence was killing me. I didn't know how to fix things for Ethan's sake. We just went through the motions and didn't speak much, even though I knew everything was ruined. I was holding on to the hope that we could go back to normal, but Thomas was getting more and more distant. I could understand why he was angry. He was left to clean up the mess. After I broke the trust we had built up over a few days, he told me that he wanted me to leave the house. His tone was calm but firm. I knew I couldn't cross that boundary. He said that because he couldn't bear to look at me, he had already started the divorce process. He added a condition that felt like a kick to the gut when I tried to protest or plead. "I'll fight for full custody of Ethan," he added in a stern and uncompromising tone. "I'll tell him everything if you refuse to see your rights." The comments took my breath away, and I could see by his attitude that he was taking it very seriously. "I'll make sure he knows exactly what you did." I couldn't stand the idea of Ethan detesting me as a child because he knew what I had done. I couldn't take the chance even though I had already lost his respect for me. I couldn't allow him to do so, so I consented. I handed up custody, signed the papers, and watched as all I had worked so hard to achieve was destroyed in an instant. I handed over the paperwork and watched as everything I had worked so hard to achieve was destroyed in an instant. It was as if the treachery wasn't enough. Thomas then called my sister Olivia to help with Ethan. I realized that my life was over and that I was solely responsible for it. She was obviously on his side from the moment she arrived. Her comments were icy and scathing, and she hardly gave me a glance. Her eyes were full of disgust. I was really excited to hear her say that I don't deserve to be part of Ethan's life. It hurt, but I couldn't do anything to protest. Olivia stayed after I left that evening, blending in with the life I had left behind. I had messed up everything, and now I was paying for it. It seemed like I was being cut off from my own family as she filled the void I had left by taking over the role I had left open. Nothing was able to fill the gap left by the excruciating. In the weeks that followed, I tried to pull myself together and hang on to whatever dignity I had left after losing my husband, my kids, and now my sister. But Thomas went even further. She took Ethan and the house he owned, and she also targeted my career. She told my boss about the affair and my inappropriate behavior. They demoted me, cut my pay, and put me in a position where I was essentially a placeholder. All of this was a huge humiliation. But they didn't fire me. I'd lost my sister, my family, and my job. Everything I'd worked for had fallen apart. Throughout it all, I had to face up to the reality of my decisions and the life I'd wasted. The few times I saw Ethan, we met at a coffee shop or a park. It was a chance to act as though nothing was wrong for a few hours. One day, during one of our brief visits, Ethan casually told me he'd seen Olivia come out of his dad's room late at night. I loved those moments, relishing every second with him. But the pain of saying goodbye and watching him return to the life I'd left behind was a constant reminder of what I'd lost. I knew precisely what it meant, and I froze as the words took hold. A few weeks later, I got an email from Thomas announcing their engagement. My own sister was living the life that should have been mine with my ex. My husband was getting married to my sister. I sat there staring at the computer, and it suddenly hit me. It was the ultimate blow. The last thread of my former existence was ripped away, leaving me alone in a world I had never envisioned for myself. My sister, my job, my husband, and my son were all gone. It's strange how stillness becomes a part of you. I saw what had happened, but it was too late. I had to try to survive the disaster I'd caused. I knew I'd brought it all on myself. Coming home to a silent house and needing someone to talk to or listen to was something I used to hate. All I have now is quiet. It seems as though everything that used to be a part of my life has disappeared: laughter, love, disagreements, and routine. It's like everything just vanished, leaving me with these empty spaces and unsolved problems. The months have just blended together since the divorce. Each time I try to fill them and make sense of what has transpired, I'm confronted with the same reality: I have done this to myself. I've tried to establish a new schedule and keep myself occupied, but it feels like I'm just going through the motions without any real purpose. Today's work is different. They took away most of my duties, and even though they kept paying me, it seems like they're just waiting for me to leave. I go into the office every day, get my work done, and avoid making eye contact. I hear the whispers when I enter the room and see the pity and glances from my colleagues. Everyone knows what happened, so it would be easy to move on and start over. But I need this work. It gives me a sense of purpose. Even though I'm not sure what I'm meant to be doing, I can't lose this. I still see Ethan, but only when Thomas lets me. I only get to spend a few hours with him each week, but they're the highlight of my week. They're also sad because they serve as a reminder of everything I can't have back. Ethan seems happy, but he doesn't understand why I left. He has Olivia and Thomas, a solid existence. It's the kind of life I thought I was providing him, but it ended up being a mistake. Thomas was presented with a version of reality that concealed the more sinister aspects. He's still young, so he's straightforward with me. He keeps his distance and looks at me with a certain distance, which is something new. He knows I harmed his dad. He asked me directly during one of our recent visits, "Mom, why did you have to go away?" I was taken aback by the question and gave him a rambling half. I gave him a vague answer about how adults sometimes make mistakes and need time to fix them. He nodded as if he was trying to understand, but I don't really get it myself. He looked at me with those big eyes that used to light up when I came into a room. I thought about it a lot, going over every decision I made, every reason I had for doing what I did, and I still come back to the same conclusion I had then. I used to think about getting in touch with Thomas to apologize again or even just to talk and clear the air because I needed to feel alive and loved. I allowed that urge to lead me to a place I can't return from. However, every time I answer the phone, I put it down again. There's not much more to say that he hasn't heard already. His life has progressed, he is currently planning a future with Olivia, who I was meant to be a part of. I don't blame them, but it's ironic that they seem happy now. Friends and family stopped calling, so perhaps they'll provide Ethan with a stable existence and a true family. That's something I was unable to maintain. People may have become weary of attempting to get in touch with me when I had nothing encouraging to say. My own sister, who decided to take up the life I left behind and chose Thomas and Ethan above me, has turned into a complete stranger. That seems sour, but it is what it is. I can't blame her for what happened when I left. She was there, ready to take over the pieces I couldn't keep together. As for Simon, I haven't seen him since shortly after the divorce. Now he's a stranger watching over a family that used to be mine. He disappeared as soon as it became clear I wasn't around anymore. He left behind a series of unanswered texts and a reminder of my own mistake. That's one of the hardest things to deal with. I've come to realize that he was never the answer to my issues, he was just a symptom of them. I've started seeing a therapist. Initially, I went because I needed someone to talk to who wouldn't reject or judge me. Now, I go because even if it's only gradually, it's helping. She's helped me view things differently and figure out where the cracks began and why I allowed them to widen. It wasn't simply Thomas feeling invisible or busy. I realized it was about me, my own fears, my own anxieties and my constant need for attention and approval. I ended up tearing my life apart in an attempt to fill those gaps. On some days I even considered contacting Ethan to request more time with him and to try to get back the position I had before. However, I always hesitate because I'm worried that I'll only make things worse and that he'll end up even more angry with me for causing trouble. On some days I just can't get rid of it. I sometimes think that when he's older, I'll have the chance to explain. But on other days, I feel that the best thing I can do for him right now is to leave him alone and let him have the family that's left. Perhaps I will be able to tell him everything, not as a justification but as the truth. I'll try to be there for him when he needs me to the extent that I can. I just hope that Thomas will let me. I wish this had a more obvious conclusion, a solution that would make sense, but that isn't how life operates. All that's left are the memories of the decisions I made, the people I harmed and the family I lost. I now accept each day as it comes since my life is a patchwork of regrets, what ifs and lessons learned. It's too late for me to change what's done, so I concentrate on the small things like my work, my treatment and the times I get to see him, even though it's only momentary. I'm learning to accept the silence and find some sort of serenity in it. I might be able to forgive myself and move on without feeling the burden of all that I lost. One day, I hope I'll be able to do that. For now, all I can do is keep moving on one step at a time and deal with the fallout from my decisions. If there is any hope remaining, it is that one day Ethan will be able to look at me and not only see my flaws. I'm waiting here until then, learning to exist in the silence I've created for myself.